Please welcome on stage the Secretary General of the Norwegian Atlantic Committee, Hansen Bundt.
I hope you had a great lunch, but now it's time for the next session. Norway and Poland, close allies in Northern Europe. As Europe adapts to an increasingly contested security environment, cooperation between aligned and capable allies has become essential. Norway and Poland are such allies. We both view Russia as the main threat to European security, and as a result, we have bolstered cooperation over the common aim to secure a Ukrainian victory. I'm greatly looking forward to the discussion of these issues with both Norway and Poland's Minister of Foreign Affairs. So first, it is my great honor to welcome up to the stage my old and good friend, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Norway, Espen Barth Eide. Minister, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Kate, for that introduction. Dear Radek, welcome to Norway. It's lovely to have you here with us at the security conference, but also in Oslo. And dear everybody, great to be here. I want to say right away, as we speak about Poland and Norway and Northern Europe, that Radek is an old friend, not because he's old, but because the friendship is old. And we have both served as defense ministers and foreign ministers, and we belong to that little club who think that it's good to have done defense before you do foreign affairs, because you see the world from slightly different perspectives. And that was in the old times. And then when Radek and I came back, and then Radek came back, we felt that the world was in some kind of order. Of course, it is not, but at least we are there, and we have a strong partnership together. And over these years, I have seen how Poland, has grown into be a key player in Europe, a key player in NATO, a very serious country in all possible respects, a star performer when it comes to defense expenditure. We are both in the high performer club, but frankly, Poland is ahead of us, a good source of inspiration, around 5% already, but also a country with whom it feels very natural to discuss deep strategic issues and their practical defense and foreign affairs implications. And we have, in this very murky and difficult world that was so well described by the previous panels, you really get to know who your near friends, close friends are, your real friends are, the closest friends are. And what has happened and this is a long-term development, but after there's at least one thing that President Putin has achieved that I appreciate, which is that he helped Finland and Sweden to finally decide that they should join NATO. And the fact that Finland and Sweden joined NATO matters for Polish-Norwegian relations for clear geographical reasons, because what has happened now is that we have a continuous landmass of NATO countries from the Barents Sea, or our part of the Arctic Sea, down to the Baltic Sea, and everything between until you get over to Russia is NATO territory. So that means a lot for military planning. It means a lot for security sharing, intel sharing and other kinds of sharing, but also for a strong sense of togetherness among what we often refer to as the NB8, the Nordic-Baltic 8 countries, which are all small or medium-sized countries, but also with our close neighbors just to the south of that, in which Poland is a key example. So, for instance, in the organization called CBSS, the Council on Baltic Sea States, that was an organization that was set up for a totally different purpose. It was like some of the other organizations that came out of the happy years of the early 90s, where we wanted to help prospecting members to become closer in practical cooperation on soft issues and also involve Russia. Now Russia has left and everybody else joined NATO, so this is now a club of 10 NATO countries. It's not a subgroup, it doesn't make any formal decisions, but it's one of the frameworks where the NB8 are connected to our friends both in Poland and in Germany. And of course we have a similar, somewhat similar setup in what is called JEF, that is the NB8 plus the United Kingdom and the Netherlands. So here in Northern Europe, in the extended Nordics and the extended Northern Europe, we see a very serious group of countries that work ever more closely together on security issues. And I think I can say that all these countries share a strong understanding of the importance of transatlantic ties. We need to continue to invest in the transatlantic partnership. We need to have the US and Canada with us in our security outlook, and that NATO is the relevant defense organization, that collective defense should happen through NATO. And there is a big room for rebalancing between Europe and North America, or Europe and plus Canada and the US rather, within NATO, because NATO would, even with a different balance, NATO would still have the protocol, the technical integration, the common standards, the command structures and so on that you would need even if you have a more Europeanized NATO. But we all also agree that there is a big room for something beyond that, because security today is much more than defense. Security is economic security, is making practical preparation for civil preparedness and the delivery of civil preparedness. And Norway chose a year and a half ago to enter into a strategic partnership with the European Union on defense and security. Then we made it very clear, again, in the preamble, that the collective defense rests with NATO, but a lot of other things can happen in a close partnership with the EU, and Poland is one of the countries that has been very supportive in that integration into those parts of EU cooperation that we and Iceland, and now also the UK, is trying to link up to without being member in the EU. After all, Norway is the world's leading experts on being in the EU without being in the EU. So we can share that experience with anybody who's interested. To the immediate east of this landmass, of course, is Russia. And as Kate very correctly said, we all agree that the #1 security issue is Russia, and that is to such a degree the #1 security issue that we have to keep it as #1. And that's actually a rather important thing to say. Whatever else we do has to be structured around the understanding that we have a very difficult neighbor in Russia, and it's not going to get any easier even if we bring the war in Ukraine to an end, maybe to the contrary. So we need to have that long-term planning. And Russia, in their own military organization, they have re-established something that is called, interestingly, the Leningrad military district, not, for instance, the St. Petersburg, but the Leningrad military district, and that's our neighbor to the east of all of us. And that also matters, because that means that from the Russian military outlook, we are in the same club, and we actually agree, we are in the same club. So they're right, and that's also why we have to make that a strong club inside of NATO and the EU. I should also say that since Poland is where we go in and out of Ukraine, either when we travel as leaders and so on, but also where most of the equipment is transported. That's why Eastern Poland becomes very important also in the context of this war. We're very happy that we've been able to take part of the collective protection of that part of Poland with our F-35s and our NASAMS, and that we also collaborate closely on Camp Jomsborg, which is where we teach and train new brigades for Ukraine to use in the war. So in all of this, we have a shared interest in developing our bilateral cooperation, or regional cooperation, to strengthen all these ties. And I will discuss this at more length with the Foreign Minister Sikorski later, but also how we plan for the long-term management of our relations to Russia and how we keep the alliance together. Norway came out last year with its first ever national security strategy. Some other countries have done that many times, and some are more interesting than others maybe. But we also made the first one in order to demonstrate that we look at security as a broad concept, but we also have to have some clear principles, and to link the defense security in a more classical sense with economic security, with resilience, with shared understanding of long-term developments is very essential. And here, this new North European partnership is very healthy. And it's very good to be able to say that in a world where most of what I talk about are increasing problems, that here we have an increasing friendship, partnership, shared interest, and it's based on a real, genuine understanding of a long-term common destiny. And that's what I wanted to say. And the main show today, of course, is Minister Sikorski.
Dear Espen, thank you for the generous introduction. Madam Secretary General, Ministers, Ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, it's true that we belong to a very exclusive club of foreign ministers who've been defense ministers. But in the last few days, I've discovered that there is an even more exclusive club. Our new Irish colleague is simultaneously foreign minister and defense minister. I'd just like it to be remembered that when I was defense minister, I bought the first Polish naval strike squadron, which includes Kongsberg missiles, and we bought a subsequent one, and it's not our last word. I am particularly pleased to be standing here before you in this magnificent hall, because our ambassador tells us that this was the place where traditionally the Nobel Peace Prize was handed over, and one of the last recipients who received it here was Danuta Wałęsa, the wife of Lech Wałęsa, who couldn't come here in person because he couldn't be sure that the communist authorities would have let him back in. So for us, in that depth of the communist oppression, in the middle of Poland's lost decade in the 1980s, it was a very moving moment. It was a lifting up of spirits and a gesture to give us hope. We were, at that time in the 1980s, the poorest in our 1,000-year history by comparison with Western Europe. We've done very well since then, which proves that democracy and free markets work. Of course, the Nobel Peace Prize is of some interest right now. Prime ministers get letters. Our Speaker of Parliament has stated this morning that unfortunately he will not be signing the ready-made nomination paper for the next Nobel Peace Prize. Apparently, as foreign ministers, we also have the right to nominate. I'm on the record saying that if President Trump secures a fair peace for Ukraine, I shall do it myself. But it's I who will decide what a fair peace is. The relationship between Poland and Norway is in the best shape ever. I can't imagine how it could be even better. Last year, Norwegian air defense systems and F-35s were the first to help protect the Polish sky. Defense cooperation has been growing steadily and effectively. Together, as Espen has already mentioned, we are helping Ukrainian soldiers who can now train in Poland in Camp Jomsborg. This year, Norway will be the strategic partner for the Warsaw Security Forum, whose boss is here. That's right. I hope you come in droves to Warsaw. It's an excellent institution. And we hold similar views and concerns. I come here with a simple message. Poland also looks north. We are willing to develop our bilateral cooperation with Norway even further. I believe our countries have a unique role to play on our continent. Our geographic locations give our countries a strategic role in their respective regions with regard to Russia. And it even goes deeper than that. You know, Poland is between East and West. In the old days at NATO, they used to joke that God created Poland for tank warfare. We are trying to get away from that image. And we now like to think of ourselves as southern Scandinavia. You may or may not know that our Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, actually belongs to the Kaszebe national minority in Poland, and they were originally a Baltic tribe. So here you are. Norway is the oldest NATO member in the region, and Poland is the biggest on the eastern flank. We are both investing in our defense capabilities, and I would venture to say that our relevance is increasingly recognized by our American allies. Russian aggression against Ukraine and Russia's hybrid war against Europe continue unabated. Putin still believes he can win. Any misunderstanding within the transatlantic family, any distraction from our real security priorities, encourages him to explore our weaknesses and fosters Kremlin's criminal endeavors. Ukrainian territorial integrity and our own security is a long-term commitment. We support efforts to find a peaceful solution to the war. But we all understand that to have peace with Putin, we need to be united and ready to defend one another. Our strategic goals are straightforward: to keep our transatlantic community strong and united, to increase European NATO capabilities in response to the Russian aggression in the face of an inevitable shift in burden sharing, to address key gaps in regional security and around the Norwegian and Baltic seas. I am impressed with Norway's growing awareness of our shared responsibility for the Baltic Sea, as Espen was just saying. I appreciate your dedication, your willingness to participate in these efforts. Poland is at the moment in the chair of the Council of Baltic Sea States, and we aim to make the organization politically stronger by adopting a more focused strategy for regional security. And I know I can count on Norway's cooperation in this effort. With the impressive world's fifth largest trading fleet and the enormous experience in private-public partnership, Norway we see as a maritime superpower. I do encourage you to take a leading role in two areas. One, halting the growth of the infamous shadow fleet, which I prefer to call clunker fleet, because shadows are harmless, but a fleet of very old tankers that don't fulfill technical criteria, that don't hold actionable insurance, and that ply enormous amounts of oil in a shallow, enclosed sea like the Baltic, is a present danger to the ecosystems and to our finances, quite frankly. Just to convince you how serious this is, I once, a couple of years ago, I asked the chairman of BP how much it cost them to clean up the mess created by Deepwater Horizon. Do you remember? In the Gulf of America, once called the Gulf of Mexico. The total cost, the rescue operation, the cleanup, and the payoffs, and the legal costs, $65 billion, half the value of the company. And secondly, we need jointly to provide assistance in the protection of maritime critical infrastructure. As you know, pipelines and underwater cables are being breached, sometimes on purpose, sometimes by accident, but we don't have the right legal framework for dealing with people who do this. The only way to defeat and keep away Russia is to continue degrading their energy sector and to limit the flow of resources to their defense companies. We believe in Alliance's principle of 360 degrees. We follow the developments in the Arctic region and share your perspective, enshrined in the already mentioned Norwegian National Security Strategy and your new Arctic strategy. The Arctic is becoming a region of growing tensions. Please be sure that you will not be alone in facing this new challenge. Poland is no newcomer to the Arctic. Next year, we will mark the 70th anniversary of the permanent Polish polar station, Hansen, in Svalbard. And we've just agreed with Espen that we would go and visit it together next year. Ladies and gentlemen, let me raise two more issues connected to security. First, economic cooperation. As the world's 20th largest economy, which Poland is now, we are ready to step up our cooperation in new fields, in IT, in quantum technologies, energy, space programs, and broader research. I'm also very proud to have learned from our ambassador this morning that the Polish petrochemical company, Orlen, is the 10th largest taxpayer in Norway. In the world of hybrid risks and trade wars, cooperation, innovation, and competitiveness are not a choice. They are a must. Secondly, Norway and the European Union. Norway is no longer a self-sufficient country on the periphery of Europe. Norway is not just yet another European country. You are a pillar of Europe's security. And in a world where long-established principles are undermined, we need more European unity. Rest assured that if you ever apply to join the European Union, I am confident in saying that whoever is in charge in Poland will vote in favor. Ladies and gentlemen, the last few years have made it very clear where our friends are, certainly in Northern Europe. The relationship between our countries is built on reliability and a shared understanding of our commitments. This allows us to plan for the long term and to act with confidence, even in an uncertain international environment. Poland has been and will remain your trustworthy and accountable ally, and we know this commitment is fully reciprocated. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to both of you for your statements. I now look forward to discuss the Norwegian-Polish or the Polish-Norwegian relationship. But I would like to start with Mr. Sikorsky. I think it was in December I read an op-ed written by you. Where you started, it was called Never Again. And you started by telling us what keeps you awake at night. Would you care to share your nightmare with us here today?
Well, remind me which particular one I was... there There are so many, and the number seems to be growing.
I think it was the rule-based international order, and we can't start this conversation without, commenting a little bit on what's going on in the beginning of this year. It's been some strange comments from the other side of the Atlantic. You wrote about that this international order that, was shaped by the memories of 2 world wars and Holocaust.
Well, in Poland we are mostly Catholic, so we know that human nature is fallible, but and that we are sinners. But it's still nice to have the 10 Commandments as an aspiration.
Yeah.
Exactly. And this is how we think of the rules-based international order.
That's good.
There have been many breaches over decades, but it was still a reference point.
Yeah. Yeah.
And now some people say that we don't even need it as a reference point, and that's a problem. We all know that the UN Security Council, for example, doesn't reflect the distribution of power in the world.
No.
Not a single African country, not a single Latin American country is a permanent member. India, 1.5 billion people, not on it. And, with the invasion of Ukraine, a permanent member of a body that was charged originally with maintaining the peace, uses its membership as an immunity from prosecution for an act of blatant aggression.
Yeah.
So sure, the UN, is in danger of going down the route of the League of Nations, but that should not be a pretext for dismantling it altogether. Also because so many UN agencies do sterling work, UNHCR, World Food Programme, and many others. And also if you are proposing an alternative, the alternative should be better than the original. And that's not what we have at the moment.
No, that's true. Espen, would you care to comment a little bit? Are we into
as a predominantly Protestant country, because we traditionally take the scripture literally. But the other part of Protestantism is that you're actually supposed to interpret yourself. So there's some space for discussing what it actually says. But I agree with you. I think we all knew that this was never perfect. This was also very central to Carney's very important speech in Davos, that it was a good order for many of us, but it was never perfect. I mean, that's good to say. But I mean, there are institutions that came out of that Pax Americana or global liberal order, which are worth preserving and adapting and modernizing. The World Trade Organization, either you have it or you don't, but if you don't have it, that's very costly for the world. You need to deal with that, but you also need to engage with are there some rules that has to be changed? We need to keep the UN, but also develop the UN. And the 3 core principles is basically, thou shall not invade other countries. That's a good rule, in my view. Thou shall try to cooperate economically when you can. And there shall be human rights in all countries. That's never been perfect, but the principles are not bad. These are good principles.
Don't change borders by force.
Yeah. The principle is good, because the connection actually between that principle and the principle of human rights is that there shall be respect for human rights within the borders, and then the borders doesn't matter so much. Far from reality, of course, but these are good principles. But we need, in the world we live in now, to really engage with how we can not only preserve, but also invent and modernize and further develop after 81 years after the Second World War.
Yeah. Sikorski mentioned that Poland is looking north. And as Europe adapts to more fragmented and contested security environment, how central is regional cooperation in different shapes, but most definitely in Northern Europe, to Poland's overall security thinking, Sikorski?
Well, we traditionally have won and lost most, if not all, our wars on land, whereas your fortes are at sea and in the air.
Exactly.
Which means that we are complementary. And this northern dimension of our policy is that we are natural allies. So for us, the sense of threat from a Russia that has adopted an imperialist state ideology, for us, it's not an option, it's existential. This is what binds us together. And when I talk about southern Scandinavia, I don't mean just the security dimension. I mean that this is our ambition, that's the kind of society we want to be. You know, there are threats to democracy, polarization and so on. And it seems that smaller countries are better positioned to withstand them because it's easier to maintain trust.
Yeah.
And we also aspire to your social model, whereby the economy is free and competitive, but government is clean and social services are at a high level. That I think is something that unites us.
When I first time I met Thomas Ylvis, who was the foreign minister of Estonia and then later president, many years later become president, the first thing he told me, very first thing to introduce his position was that, Espen, we Estonians want to become like you, another boring Nordic country. And you know, actually, thinking back, it was not such a bad for exactly those reasons. So, but I felt that over these years being very close, you know, and many times together with Radek, but to see this developing Nordic-Baltic plus, and Poland included here, is that we learn from each other. You know, that the countries that came out of the Soviet Union or the Warsaw Pact bring with them a very relevant experience that we are well advised to listen to and learn from. And in the early days, that was seen as they hadn't really got the new memo of you know, harmony and togetherness and let's all give each other a big hug. But it turned out that that experience was actually quite relevant. On the other hand, the Nordics have also some experience, some sisu and some calm and so on, which can also be helpful. So I think we have mutually developed together, you know, building on these different experiences in our outlook. So it's much more than just the pragmatic cooperation based on day-to-day common interest. It's actually growing into something deeper. And we will be the first ones to say that we're happy that the formal institutions we belong to are big, like NATO and the EU and EA and so on, but to have this regional partnership for the long term is, you know, makes it stronger. So we're strengthening. I think this kind of cooperation makes both NATO and the EU stronger. And then one point of geography, if you're Russia and you want to sail west, there are 3 ways out. First one is through the Black Sea and out through the Bosporus. Whereas the Bosporus, thin line, NATO is Turkey is NATO, can be choked very easily. Then there are 2 remaining outlets. That's the Baltic Sea and the Barents Sea, the Arctic Sea, and that's it. Otherwise, you have to go the other way around. So if you're interested in what you call not the shadow fleet, but the
Clunker
fleet, but also the more sort of military dimensions, you know, being in control of these waterways is actually very relevant for strategic purposes. And as Radek says, you know, they have a traditional land focus, so does the Finns. We have more a naval and sea focus. Fine, because then we do things together that we literally become stronger together.
Could you be a bit more concrete? Because Sikorski mentioned that Norway is sharing responsibility of the Baltic, and we have, you know, more and more integrated to that. How do we do that concretely?
I mean, first we are literally in Poland because of you know, the
Jomsborg,
and then we're also been involved in the work around this Baltic Sentry and rotating in and out of air policing roles and so on. But I think we have gradually learned over decades that we are also a Baltic country. I say in quotation marks because it's a little stretch to say we're in the Baltics. I remember Thorvald Stoltenberg, this only the Norwegian will understand, he brought the fylkesordfører from Østfold, because that was the closest you got to the Baltic.
Yeah. To the Baltic.
To a Baltic Sea. But the thing is that it's so important for a strategy. And remember, what was the Baltics and what is it? You know, 35 years ago, it was 2 neutral countries in the north. It was Russia and 3 other Soviet part, the 3 Baltic states. It was Poland in the Warsaw Pact, and it was GDR, and there's a tiny bit of Denmark and West Germany. And now it's the other way around. The only Russia left is Kaliningrad and the sailing route into St. Petersburg. Everything else is NATO. So that has really changed, and so is our Arctic. So we need to understand that we're also Baltic. And our friends, thankfully, are also realizing that they are, in a sense, also Arctic. Not in a physical sense, but they should care about what happens in the Arctic, and that's good.
Yes, if you look at the Norwegian long coastline, it's the reinforcement of Allied forces will come there also, so that's important.
And the number one, the most important conglomeration of nuclear weapons in our neighborhood is in Kola, and that's where the second strike capability is. If you don't control the waters, but also the land behind the waters, you will give them a free
That's
rein.
true.
Yeah.
There's also a longer history of your involvement in my part of the world than some people appreciate. Didn't Charles XII die besieging some Norwegian fort? He did, didn't he?
He did.
It's all his fault. Because if he hadn't lost the Battle of Poltava, everything would be different today.
Yeah.
But we took him
Poltava is on the way
to
For those who don't know where Poltava is, it's one of the last stops on the way to Kharkiv.
But he died in Halden in Norway.
We took
Probably shot from one of his own.
It was a different government.
It was. Okay. At least you were not defense minister at that time. No. You both have been Minister of Defense. I think that's how valuable, or what does that do with your view as foreign ministers to have had the experience of being defense minister?
Well, first of all, defense ministries are harder to run than foreign ministers.
Yeah.
You have, in most countries, between 20 and 25 times the budget. But it also teaches you to be much more concrete and results-oriented.
Yeah.
They have also different institutional cultures. So at the defense ministry, when the minister says something, on the whole, they try to carry it out. At the foreign ministry, a minister's decision is an invitation to a discussion about whether it's a good idea.
Okay. Espen, did you recall that from your...
Well, what I would say is that, increasingly defense ministries and foreign ministries deal with many of the same issues. I see there's another former defense minister on the first row. But, in defense, you need to be at the strategic level, but you also have to make sure that very practical things happen. Not that you do it yourself, obviously, but you must ensure, because you need both to have a strategy, but you also need to know that there are batteries for the radio and you can charge them in the field. I mean, that whole spectrum, and that is more present in everyday life in a defense ministry than in the foreign ministry, and that's a good background, actually, that you have the things have consequences, but also to be in charge of the military. And of course, we are the CHOD. It's also a good experience is that it's an organization that has first it's there to fight wars, obviously, and to prepare for that. But also that if something, they're trained to sustain themselves in very critical situations. So if somebody says that something should happen here, it actually happens over there because there's a chain of command, and they can, you not only take care of the enemy, but also make sure that you're still around when you do it because everything else fails. So that's an experience which is a good background. I think. Yeah.
Sikorski, do the recent developments around Greenland and the High North change how Poland thinks about European security, interdependence, and its relations and dependency of the United States?
Well, we signed the Paris Declaration on Denmark's sovereignty. We make no claims on Danish territory, even though we had a war over Bornholm in the early 16th century.
Okay.
But speaking seriously, I wish the issue would just go away. because the United States has complete operational freedom in Greenland. Also in literally tomorrow I'm flying to Washington to a critical minerals conference that the United States is convening to try to see what we can do vis-à-vis this Chinese blackmail.
Yeah.
And of course Greenland is open to American and anybody else's effort to find these materials there. And we even had a concession, even Poland had a concession once. So it's an unnecessary distraction.
I would like to follow up. You invited us to the European Union and said that you or any future Polish government will vote for a Norwegian membership. But
I'll tell you more.
Okay.
Because I saw this excellent series about Norway called Occupied.
Oh, yeah.
Which, if you haven't seen it,
yes.
is the evil European Union getting the Russians occupy Norway and collaborating with the Russians. Well, as long as I have anything to do with the Polish government, Poland will not participate in the occupation of Norway.
Okay, good.
That's a deal. Yeah.
But to follow up on that, this morning I had a discussion with Kaja Kallas and our Prime Minister on Europe as a security actor, where Kallas and also followed up on Mark Rutte last week that the EU should not be a defense union. How do you see it from Poland?
Well, here you're treading on my sensitive nerve, because this subject has been a pet subject for me for decades, actually. But it's a sorry story. After the wars of the Yugoslav succession, in which 200,000 plus people died, we decided at that time to create a European intervention force of between 40 and 70,000 people, and nothing happened. Then the British, when they were still members, devised this concept of battle groups. And theoretically, at any one time, there are 3 countries that are on standby and delegate a battalion each to a brigade-size unit, which theoretically could be used in some kind of emergency. But they've never been used because the 3 countries would have to agree simultaneously, because they would have to pay for it, because the risks would be disproportionately falling on them. And we've promised ourselves in the Lisbon Treaty to have a common foreign and security policy, which is mostly not observed. On anything important, the largest member states act unilaterally or jointly amongst themselves. We have had some EU military operations, but very marginal. So there was a strike on some Somali pilots 15 years ago. There were some peacekeeping missions in Africa, but very, very low level. When I was a member of the European Parliament, I was banging on about it all the time. You know, what has to happen? Does Putin have to invade Ukraine for all of you to understand that we should not be defenseless? And I think this question is becoming more relevant at a time when our American allies are telling us frankly, we do not have either the capacity or even perhaps the will to attend to 2 crises simultaneously around the globe, and you have to take better care of yourself. And, you know, we had a legal mechanism in the Lisbon Treaty. It was called Permanent Structured Cooperation in the Area of Defense. Originally, Bernard Kouchner, the foreign minister of France, and myself, we proposed that we use it as an avant-garde method of getting together countries that are serious about defense, that are willing to pool their, to unify their rules of engagement, to really put their troops under unified command, to allow their citizens to serve in such a unit voluntarily, and for it to be under the authority of the Foreign Affairs Council, and for it to be funded from the EU budget. Because only then would you be tempted to use it. And of course it wouldn't be enough to deter Putin. But some warlord in Libya, or some warlord in the Balkans, maybe. And it's I call it a European Legion, others call it, the bureaucratic term for it is a rapid reaction capacity. I think it's supposed to become operational this year, but I'll believe it when I see it.
But no, if I may, because now please. Now there is Poland is already there, but there is a strong and I think quite realistic ambition by many countries, hopefully all, but at least by many, to have real significant defense spending increases in the coming years. That means much more money for defense. And one thing you take away from background as a defense minister is that money for defense can be spent smartly and not so smartly. So it's particularly important to be very strategic in how that new available money is being used. And here that is used, that there's more and that it actually get bang for the bucks, which also has to do with development of defense industries, including in Europe, and that it is used smartly and that it's used together. Because this is really the time for not trying to have a myriad of copies of each other, but rather specialize more. That's much easier said than done, by all means. But I think this is really the time to think about that. And whether you call that European or transatlantic, it still has to happen in Europe. So that might be a new opportunity with a new degree of realism of Europe needing to be able to fight in a higher level of crisis before the Americans will come substantively to our assistance, even if they're allies.
In the last session, I got a question from the audience about a kind of Nordic nuclear deterrence due to the different situation with the United States and the doubt of the security guarantee. Is Poland discussing to acquire nuclear weapons?
No, we're not. First of all, because we are in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and secondly, because nukes have shown to be useless in the Russia-Ukraine war, and thirdly, because Iran shows you that whereas getting a nuclear weapon like North Korea is useful, it assures regime preservation and is a deterrence, getting from A to B is very dangerous, takes a long time, and can ruin your country and prove counterproductive.
A Nordic nuclear deterrence?
We're not planning to build a Norwegian nuclear weapon. No, but seriously, I mean, nuclear is integrated, and it's a very integral part of NATO's defense strategy. And the stronger the credibility of the US nuclear umbrella, the less countries will be inspired to make their own nukes. That's true in Europe, it's true in East Asia, for Japan and South Korea. So preserving the credibility, the relevance, credibility of the nuclear umbrella is essential, very, very high on the agenda. And frankly, there's not that much European. The French weapons are French. The UK might, in a sense, be European if the British want, but they're very American technologically anyway. So there isn't really, to be honest, very much of a European alternative to the umbrella. And NPT has to be remembered. And in the late 60s, people thought there would be 40, 50 nuclear states. It did not happen. And it's because of NPT and the US nuclear umbrella, because many of the potential candidates felt they didn't need to. So that's a strong argument that it's peaceful for the world to try to preserve a US
and
umbrella.
To keep NATO in Article 5, but we don't know if it's will be there in the future.
Russia has 6,000 warheads. Imagine the effort it would take to produce a response to that.
Sounds expensive.
But I would like to, Poland is a fast-growing economy and also a considerable military power use, is spending almost 5% of GDP on defense.
Which doesn't tell you what our status is. So minus the nuclear deterrent, our defense budget in absolute numbers is now bigger than France's.
Yeah. Exactly. So what role do you foresee for Poland in shaping a future security order, be it a European Canadian pillar inside NATO with some American contribution, or be it in different coalition of the willing, or looking long term?
We are a peaceful democracy. We just want to be left alone.
Yeah, but your geography matters.
But unfortunately, one of our neighbors has redeveloped an imperialist state ideology. And therefore, we can't pretend that we don't notice it. Exactly. And of course, we like NATO as it has existed historically, for common defense. NATO is likely to be more reduced in Europe, reduced perhaps to the nuclear umbrella, to strategic enablers. And our American allies are telling us that we have to provide most of the muscle on land. And this is what we're preparing for. So,
but more, I agree, but more European muscle can also be NATO.
Exactly.
So, the US presence might go down and be, predominantly the umbrella, but you can still do much of the European build-up inside NATO.
Although I have to say it's sometimes frustrating when you hear the US castigating us for not spending enough, and Poland has been spending 2% for 20 years. No. We are now at 4.8%. Yeah. And it sometimes sounds as if the US is getting nothing in return. Yeah. Hello, isn't Ramstein useful to the United States? Isn't the missile defense base in Poland useful to the United States? Remember, the great majority of the US defense budget is not spent on the defense of Europe.
Yeah, exactly.
It is, we don't have a global military empire. We need to spend enough not to be as good as the United States. We just have to be better than Putin.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
And that's perfectly achievable.
Okay, yeah. We have to talk a little bit about Ukraine and our common efforts to secure a victory for the Ukrainians. We cannot come in the situation that the most experienced army in Europe fall in the hands of the Russians. Could you tell a bit about the Jomsborg cooperation? And you built it very fast this summer, the Camp Jomsborg. How is the cooperation functioning, and how is this contributing to deepening our cooperation, Sikorski and then Espen?
Well, we've leased a piece of Polish territory to Norway, and we're very glad that you are developing a training facility there, which hopefully will be useful when the coalition of the willing helps to preserve the peace in Ukraine. Let's be honest with ourselves. When the Russians invaded, very few of us thought that Ukraine would be able to sustain this for 4 years.
Exactly.
I mean, when you take a broad view, Ukraine overperformed. Europe and the United States also overperformed. I thought we would I thought we would be lucky to get Russia cut off from SWIFT.
Yeah.
Actually, our sanctions have gone much further than that. And if you'd asked me on the day of the invasion whether the United States would risk its sources to provide Ukraine strategic intelligence to deprive the Russians of a plausible casus belli, that was actually brilliant and brave. We also made some mistakes, I think, in 2023, when Ukraine was on the march. the then administration deterred itself from giving them more support to try to win the war. And in general, we have rather been in the frame of mind of helping Ukraine survive rather than giving them enough to win.
Yeah.
And this is why this war is taking so long.
Espen.
Indeed, and Camp Jomsborg is part of that because that's where we help train the new Ukrainian brigades. And I think a key question now in the ongoing discussions about security guarantees, the most important guarantee is a guaranteed continued support for the Ukrainian army and military capacity in the long run. I mean, there are other elements to it, but the first deterrent has to be a continued strong Ukrainian military capacity, which might be a somewhat smaller in number than while you fight war. That's also for discussion, but which of course needs the capacity to not only defend but also be somebody you don't want to attack from Russia's side, and then everything else comes later. So to focus both on how to get to a ceasefire, but also what it's going to look like after that ceasefire and after an eventual peace is very high on our agenda, and we can never. You always, you have to get to the future, but you have to think about the future as well.
Exactly.
And there is an increasing amount of shared energy spent on thinking about what is the post-war status of Ukraine, how can we help them after the war, and how do we deal with Russia when they're not tied up in Ukraine any longer. And that thinking needs to happen now. Because the final days and weeks of every war in history, a lot of things fall into place, for good or bad, and then you're stuck with them for decades. We know that from so many cases, and if you're not firm on what outcome you want, and it has to be more advanced than just stop the killing. I mean, that's a good goal, but that's not it. It has to be defendable, understandable, clear. There has to be some surveillance. Somebody has to monitor, and you need to know what to do if it fails. Otherwise, it's not a real peace.
If I may just jump in, I'm really concerned about this because if we have a ceasefire along the line of contact, that's not a natural border.
No.
Ukraine needs defensible borders at the end of this process, and the line of contact ain't it. And if that's where the armistice falls, it's a recipe for another war.
But looking at the different, the US involved in trying to get a ceasefire or a peace negotiations, I think that Europe is always acting reactive. Isn't it possible to get some initiative from the European side first?
I completely agree with you. President Trump likes to ask partners what cards they have.
Yeah.
And the last two cards that the US has is some intelligence sharing to do with targeting, plus sanctions.
Yeah.
We are now bankrolling the Ukrainian state, and we are paying for the war. And yet we have to sometimes beg the US to even be informed about the state of their negotiations. That's not how it should be.
No.
And it's important when Radek says we, that we Europeans, but frankly, it is from Poland and Germany and upwards where you see the big numbers. So we're proud of being one of the countries that contribute much, but I'm worried that we shouldn't be so big on the percentage, on the total percentage, because there are other countries that are also affected. So again, we're closer to the conflict. Poland, Finland, Norway feel that this is very existential for us directly, but we need to share that with the broader crowd.
Let's end with some positive signs. Minister Sikorski invited in his speech new economic cooperation with Norway in new fields. Do you have something to come up with?
Well, we're cooperating. There are, I think there will be more news about concrete cooperation coming up in the course of the day, to say that first. But there's also It's a very fast-growing partnership on all fronts, civilian and military. And Poland is a growing, I mean, many countries have benefited of joining the EU. I don't really think anybody's benefited as much and as demonstrably as Poland. That has made it also a big market for us. And Radek said earlier today that we're compatible with, and this is also true for our economic partnership. So on all these things, there will be more.
Yeah, good.
But inside the framework of the EU/EEA, which means that we have a single market, and that single market is increasingly important to preserve. And we work with our close friends to remind them that the single market does not have 27 members, but 30. So please remember Iceland, Norway, and Liechtenstein every day when you get up in the morning. And that's always work in progress. Yeah.
And when people say they are half Scandinavian, we should accept them.
Bring it on. Yeah. There's space.
Your financial credibility is such that you don't need the safe instruments. But for us, it's important. It's 150 billion euros for reindustrializing Europe in the area of defense. And here we already have some important projects, and I am sure we will have more.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for a very interesting discussion and reflecting so openly on where we stand in European security today, and particularly to Mr. Sikorski taking the time to come to Oslo to our conference. And I hope you have had good conversation with others as well. And safe flight back. Yes, then
Thank you.
Give them a big hand.
Thank you.
So, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good. Boss is there. Yeah.
So, please be seated. When these two ministers leave the room, we are going to start a new discussion. Please let me introduce my good friend, Professor Ulf Sverdrup, who is going to moderate the next panel on how to deter Russia while carving out a future path for Ukraine. Welcome to the stage.
Thank you so much.
Good God. Good. Well, actually, okay.
Thank you so much, Kate. I see the Polish foreign minister is leaving, and I must confess I have been visiting Hansen, the scientific base of Poland in Svalbard. Not only is it an amazing place, but it probably has the best view also on Svalbard. It's beautiful of the mountains. So that is a testimony also to the linkages between Norway and Poland. Now we are having a small, short hour to discuss how to deter Russia while carving out a future path for Ukraine. And I'm joined here with an excellent group of experts to help us to discuss and enlighten us on this topic. Katarzyna Pisarska, she's a professor from Poland. She's the chair of the Warsaw Security Forum that Radek Sikorski talked so warmly about. And it's true, it's an excellent gathering. Great to have you here. And then Keir Giles, he's has a long and distinguished career as he calls himself a Russia explainer these days. And he has published a book in 2019 about Russia being at war with everybody, weaponizing everything. And more recently a book on how to deter Russia and how to defend Europe. And then last but not least, Arne Bård Dalhaug. He's a Lieutenant General, retired, but he's a senior advisor in the Norwegian Atlantic Committee, is organizing this event. And many of you also know him as a distinguished and experienced expert on TV, helping to explain Norwegians about the developments in Ukraine. But we have had this so far during this very nice conference. We have discussed a bit about Norway, the Nordics. We talked about Europe. We talked about transatlantic challenges. We touched upon Ukraine. But today, in this panel, we're going to deal a bit more on Russia. So, Keir, I would like to turn it over to you first, because, you know, Keir is not only a Russia expert. Some of you might have listened to probably one of the best podcasts that came out last year. It's called War Games on Sky. If you haven't listened to it, download it. But after this session, it's 5 hours. And in that session, Keir is acting as Putin. He's the impersonation of Putin. So, Keir, can I ask you, if Putin had been watching the stream of this conference so far, or seen European media during the last few weeks, what would be his remarks, or what's going on in his mind when he reads what's going on in the transatlantic relationship during the last few weeks?
I think whoever Russia has delegated to report back on this conference, and whether you're sitting in the room with us now or watching the playback later, will probably say that Russia can continue to be fairly comfortable. Because at least this morning we heard a great deal more about NATO's problems than about solutions. We heard a lot more about what could or should be done than what has been done or even is being done. Leaving aside that whole question of how Europe should deal with Donald Trump's America, which I'm sure will come up again in the discussion, despite having been done to death this morning, it's as plain to see from Russia as it is from Europe that the divide in Europe is still alive and strong. The divide between those countries that are frontline states and don't need to be told to spend on their own defense, and the countries that are west and south of Warsaw, some of whom think that they have now bought off the United States with a promise of a more or less fictional 5% and can now go back to sleep. Either through working that figure through accountancy fudges, balancing budgets, moving things from one bucket to another, or by incremental increases of 1/10 of a percentage point of GDP per year, and looking for targets far, far in the future, which are far beyond when they're assessing Russia might be ready to test them. So in that respect, time is on Russia's side, especially because Russia can pick and choose the moment when it decides to agree to whatever ceasefire package is put on the table by the United States, meeting all of Russia's terms. Ukraine, of course, does not have the same luxury of time. And Russia can always drill deeper into what is actually being done about defense and resilience across Europe. They can compare the words and the actions in terms of security, in terms of preparing populations, in terms of tackling the shadow fleet or the clunker fleet, where, yes, this must be done, and then it continues to fail to happen. Not to mention all of the discussions we heard this morning about the input side of defense, spending, how much is actually spent on defense as opposed to what it buys. Now, even the 5% is not being used as an instrument of shame for those countries that appear disinclined to meet it, let alone the defense output, NATO's regional plans and the yawning gaps in them between what countries have promised and what they're actually delivering. So, sitting back in Moscow, I think Russia, for the time being, and Putin and those around him, can be relatively relaxed and can choose their moment to extract the maximum possible from an end to major combat operations in Ukraine in order to prepare themselves as best possible for their next move.
Just pick up on, so during the last year, we've seen the oil price drop quite significantly. There are more systematic attempts now to address the parallel fleet, or the dark fleet, or shadow fleet, or whatever you call it. You see that Ukrainian have been quite successful in targeting different refineries and different elements, and due to the sanctions, it's getting harder for Russia to repair their production facility, etc. So, according to some reports, at least, there's more pain and less revenues generated for the Russian. So what's your take on that aspect on it? Because you painted a picture of, well, Putin should be rather confident, but there are some signs that, of course, this is not a kind of easy switch on or off, but the pain of this war economically for Russia is also increasing. Not to touch upon the human costs he's imposing on his sons and daughters.
Well, let's separate out the short term and the long term. In the short term, yes, it is inconvenient that Ukraine is enjoying success in targeting some Russian refineries. Inconvenient rather than painful because of the sheer scale of the Russian oil refining industry and how little of it can be reached. But still, it's a successful strategy, and that's the reason why the United States constrained Ukraine from doing it up until the very end of the Biden administration. Does it hurt? Yes. Does it hurt a lot? No. Is there action against the parallel fleet, the shadow fleet? Well, we hear in the UK that after years of calls to do something about it, they finally found a legal justification for doing so down the back of a filing cabinet somewhere, which for a government of lawyers in my country ought to be all they need, but yet we don't actually see the action yet. I hope that may change, and I hope it may impose greater costs on Russia, forcing them to find another means of deriving that revenue from their oil exports. But I'm not for the time being holding my breath, given how difficult it has been to achieve any agreement on that so far. In the long term, it's a different picture for Russia's economy, for its demography, for the state of its country. All of those are going to be in a very dire state. The country is suffering permanent economic damage that will be irreversible over the long term, but this appears not to be of a concern to the current Russian leadership, because the messianism, the drive, the mission to restore the empire, the mission to rebuild the Russia of Putin's imagining, and let's not forget tens of millions of Russians with him, is more important than the long-term outcomes, it seems. So, in the long term, in so many ways, Russia is going to be a very much weaker state, but we need to survive the short and the medium term.
Okay, thank you so much. I should have said initially that, of course, you can join in on this discussion by using the Slido. And we talked between ourselves that Slido is actually an engagement killer rather than a facilitator. So if there's a microphone out there, and if you want to raise your hand and stand up, so let's bring the microphones on as well. Or Kate is shaking her heads, but I think we can give it a try at least. Anyway, Katarzyna, let's move on to the ongoing negotiations on a peace deal or ceasefire or whatever. It was supposed to be a new round in Abu Dhabi or today, but it's postponed, as I understood. And apparently, over the weekend, the Americans met with the Russians, talking very promising discussions without the Ukrainians at the table. So, but how do you view the peace talks and the prospect for those, as you see it from Warsaw and from being a European leader?
Absolutely. Thank you. And first of all, it's a pleasure truly to be here. As Minister Sikorski said, Norway is the partner country this year of the Warsaw Security Forum. So we have multitude of engagements this year with different partners, from the parliamentarians to civil society to think tanks such as the Norwegian Atlantic Council. It's a really pleasure to be here. And of course, we invite you back in October to Warsaw. Now, to answer your question, I think to understand these negotiations, and I think there's a general understanding of what's going on that is equally in-depth in Warsaw and in Kiev. So I think when I speak with my Ukrainian friends, I think they think pretty much the same as we see this in Warsaw. We make a number of assumptions that sometimes it feels the media don't want to make and the politicians are afraid to make, but you have to make when you look at these discussions and negotiations. And the first and the most important assumption is that in these negotiations, Trump favors Putin over Zelensky and favors Russia's point of view over Ukrainians. Yeah, and this is the starting point that you have to start from to even start understanding what's going on in negotiations. Second, Trump, of course, follows less so the US interest. I think we saw this in Greenland and other cases, much more so his own interest. Whatever that interest, however you define it, whether it's an ego or financial gain that he sees the negotiations with the Russians, for him are really the real partners of these negotiations, as a larger deal. Ukraine is a sideshow to these negotiations, which has to be dealt with because the world expects him to deal with it, and he might get that Peace Prize Nobel if he does this right. But in reality, what's interesting for him is what the Russians have to propose to him and his entourage, less so to the United States, because the Russians, as you know, have never been a major trading partner for the United States and have, even in energy, has been more of a competition than really a collaborator for the United States. So that's what you have to understand on the American side. What you have to understand on the Russian side is that Russia believes that time favors not only Russia, but time favors authoritarianism. So that democracy is in decline. That's what Putin has been saying for years and years now. But what he sees in the last 2 years is a fast-forward movement to a completely different world. And he simply needs to outlast. He needs to outlast Ukraine. He needs to outlast Western political cycles. And in the meantime, maybe improve his negotiating position and test the West in these negotiations. So in that sense, he's not really serious about getting a permanent peace deal. What he wants is to see something tactical, reversible, ambiguous concessions, because he doesn't trust Trump, of course. He doesn't trust that whatever is going to be said at these negotiations is going to be delivered at the end. So whatever they promise, it has to be he has to be able to reverse from that. If anything is a good indication, I think the 2015 Minsk II agreements were just that. There were a number of things we agreed with the Russians. They never delivered on them, and they agreed to it because they knew they could never deliver, and nobody could force them to deliver on these issues. So that is where the Russians are currently at. And last, where are the Ukrainians? Well, the Ukrainians, we know where they are. They are in a very difficult situation. They're trying to get some kind of security guarantees. They understand that these security guarantees will not be in any way ironclad. They're trying to test what is at all possible and how much they can engage the Europeans, of course, with the big wish that actually European troops, NATO troops, will find their boots on Ukrainian soil, which for Putin is completely unacceptable. That is one thing that would be game over for Putin if actually European peace troops would find themselves around Kiev, because that would go counter-narrative to everything he said to his population, that he's fighting the war to keep NATO out of Ukraine, away from the borders, and not back in. So Putin cannot agree for this. And last, where is Europe in this? Well, I think that's the good news. Europe is united in diagnosis of the situation. So we understand what's at stake, but we are not aligned on security threats, what you said. So there is how much really risk are we willing to take to help Ukraine? Because I think, majority of Europe agrees we have to help Ukraine. But how much risks are we willing to take? How much initiative are we willing to take? That differs very much from country to country. So this is where we are in negotiations. What we should be doing, I'm happy to say later, because for the sake of the discussions, but I think only if you have this in mind, you understand one and the only thing. These negotiations are not going anywhere in terms of a durable peace. We have to prepare for the long term and somehow prepare Ukraine for the long term.
Yeah. So to me it seems that like the Ukrainians have one plan A is basically to play along with the negotiations and try to be as constructive as possible and to give away actually very painfully concessions. But of course with some firm red lines on the Donbass and on the security guarantees. And then you have the plan B, that this will just fall apart and there will be no successful. So, but listening to you, almost like they should switch around. So the plan B is basically the plan A.
Well, again, if you speak with people in Kiev, that is their thinking. Yeah. Even if you speak about it with people on the streets, only 15% of Ukrainians believe that this is going to succeed. 15%. There's no hope that these negotiations will go anywhere, especially that it's clear that the main issue, so giving up Donbass, giving up the fortifications, basically means giving the only security guarantees that Ukraine currently has. The fortifications in Donbass are the security guarantees for. So what would you replace it for? For what exactly? I mean, how much would we have to promise and deliver for the Russians, for the Ukrainian soldiers to actually decide to leave these fortifications? I think, mentally for Ukrainians, that would have to be something incredible. And Zelensky has said this many times, he will not do anything without public support. Anything, and especially giving up land, moving around. He talked about referendums and so on. And that is not there. And neither, that's a different story, the state of mind of the Russian and Ukrainian societies. Both are also, although the Russians actually today seem to, the society is fatigued with the war, would like to see a resolution, but without giving up any land, just freezing the border. The Ukrainian society also wants this to end, but is not willing to give away anything more than it already had lost.
Okay, thank you so much. You touched upon, you brought up several issues that we need to come back to, also to European cohesion, etc. But I want to bring in Arne Bård as well. So, from your perspective as a military expert following the battlefield also in Ukraine and the situation, could you give an assessment, an overview of how are things unfolding in Ukraine now? We heard from Radek Sikorski that it's quite amazing to see the endurance and the strength of the Ukrainians, how successful they have been for not only 4 years, but for 12 years in trying to fight back on the Russians. So, but how do you see it now, after weeks and months of systematic attacks on energy infrastructure from the Russian side, etc.?
Yes, thanks a lot, Ulf. I'm slightly concerned that I have to admit that I basically see the world like you do when it comes to the peace negotiations and everything. And if I may address a few words on where I think I see these negotiations going, I will do that first, and then I will briefly comment on how I view the battlefield situation. I think it's just with that, as I said, I do agree a lot with what you said, and I think it's one thing we should be aware of is that it's very evident to me that the United States never pursued an outcome to the war that would reinforce international norms or the principles of international law. And I think that's quite important, because all proposals advanced by Trump have basically accepted that Russia may seize territory from a neighboring state and makes it its own. And I think that's a really bad assumption to start with, but that's where all the peace talks have started. Basic problem with the one that's now also on the table is that the Europeans, the Ukrainian, and the US has reached some kind of agreement that is, in a way, acceptable to Ukraine and also acceptable to the United States and also to Europe, of course. The problem with all these so-called negotiations is that there is never a plan to put enough pressure on Russia to make them give up on the maximalist political objectives of subjugating Ukraine and just take away the sovereignty from Ukraine. That's basically what they are looking for. And of course, the problem is that the present draft of the peace agreement, or whatever we like to call it, is that it's viewed as not acceptable from Moscow. They have been very much clear about that. And so I agree to the fact that I don't see that these negotiations are going anywhere. And of course, if Ukraine were to concede Donbass, it would also entail the loss of terrain of considerable strategic military importance. And normally also when these issues are discussed, we don't discuss how much freedom does Putin have to end the war. Putin needs very much a convincing victory. That it's obvious that Russia won the war. There must be no questions in the aftermath of the war if it was worth taking all the losses. And that's important to understand. Putin has for sure never envisaged an end to the war with an agreement that would actually constrain the freedom of maneuver for Russia vis-à-vis Ukraine. I mean, just imagine if you look at this from Moscow, and every now and then I feel like Putin's spokesperson on these issues. I mean, the optics of the war, I mean, we should remember it has produced 2 new NATO members. That's directly against all what Putin wanted in December 2021. It's left roughly, if you accept where the front line is now, 80% of Ukraine will still be under Kyiv's control and oriented towards the west. The war has inflicted enormous Russian losses for minimal strategic gain. Resulted, it could, on Western troops on the ground. I mean, unsurprisingly, that's viewed as a catastrophe from Moscow's perspective. This is how the proposed settlement looks from Moscow, even if it's tilted quite a bit in the Russian favor. So, I mean, if you view it through a lens like this, it becomes apparent that you really will have to use the most forceful measures to make Russia accept some compromise, because this really doesn't look good. And this is the kind of agreement right now that I don't think Putin will actually be able to live with. I mean, the survival of the regime could very well be at stake if it doesn't end up with a good enough agreement. So the best way, of course, forward is to see to it enough support to Ukraine to put a lot more pressure on Russia. And so how is the war going?
Arne, so
Yes.
we stop there and we return to because I want to take in care on this, on the peace agreement. So what we hear from Arne is that, well, Russia is not ready to give anything in the peace negotiations, and also the same we hear from Katarzyna. So, and you also said that initially that Russia is probably in a feeling that in a pretty good situation. Then the question is then, how can we, the West, help to support Ukraine in order to achieve more pressure and to change some of the facts on the ground or change the situation? And as part of that, also, what kind of vulnerabilities do you see in the Russian economy, in the Russian system, that could kind of change the Russian configuration or outlook then?
Well, Arne pointed out that Russia is not going to accept a ceasefire, that will not allow it to violate the ceasefire or to restart the conflict at any time. And that's completely correct. He also said that the war continues because the coalition backing Ukraine, led by the United States, has not decided to end it, has not decided to intervene to bring it to an end on the basis of the international norms that we all say we subscribe to. Of course, that goes both ways, because both coalitions supporting each side in this war, the coalition supporting Ukraine, the coalition supporting Russia, have decided not to intervene.
To significantly change the
to decisively intervene so that it brings it to an end, as opposed to keeping both sides fighting for as long as possible, for very different interests, whether you are China or the United States. So the wild card that has been introduced with the arrival of Donald Trump has, in effect, rescued Russia by extending the period for which they could keep this going. But at the same time, it could come to a very sudden end in an unexpected manner if it were Ukraine, not its coalition, but Ukraine itself, that decided that Russia had finally succeeded in making life in its cities unsustainable, and therefore it had to accept whatever terms were dictated with the facilitation of Donald Trump. That is not going to happen to Russia soon. It will take far, far longer for that impact, that attrition, that devastating damage to actually influence Russia's decision-making calculus, particularly because they have the kind of support from their coalition backers that are actually meaningful. Manpower from North Korea precisely when it's needed. Support from China to keep the defense industry going. The reluctance or refusal of Europe to throttle the income that comes from the shadow fleet. All of these help keep Russia going at a time when all of the pressure is on Kyiv to surrender. But just in case you thought we were all going to just sit here agreeing with each other all of the time, I'm just going to pick up on one thing that...
yeah, please throw in some disagreements as well.
Katarzyna said we have conceptual understanding among us in Europe about the nature of this ceasefire. I don't think that's quite true. We do on this stage, and
on
possibly
the threat of
in
Russia,
this room.
On the threat of coming, not the ceasefire.
Very good. Okay,
Sorry,
that's good.
That wasn't,
that's good. Because the threat of Russia, yes, people have understood that, and Putin has been the greatest friend of people like me who've been trying to point out for 20 years that Russia is a problem because they finally demonstrated it. But in terms of the ceasefire, it often seems that we are engaging in a collective hallucination, that there is a meaningful peace process that will lead to a viable ceasefire, and that in turn will make Europe more safe, not less safe. All of these things are demonstrably untrue, and yet we play along with them. And I think the reason comes down to the Plan A and Plan B that you referred to. It's not just Ukraine, but Europe that has a Plan A and a Plan B. Plan A is to play along with Trump's United States, to pretend that relations are normal, to play into this pretense at a peace process, this pantomime, in order to keep the relationship with the United States on track without pointing at its contradictions. Plan B, of course, is to prepare for when that pretense is no longer sustainable, and there is the rupture of which we've heard so much. Just as Plan B for Ukraine is to prepare for when this whole process falls through and they are on their own. We'd like to see a lot more evidence that that Plan B is actually happening and that we are not just hoping for the best, but also preparing for the worst.
Yeah, so, but Keir, aren't we already on this Plan B scenario in the sense that, okay, US has basically stopped paying for the war, did that almost a year ago. They still supply weapons, but as I understand it, the price is increasing. Europe is paying for the money, for most of it. And also the Europeans, as I understand it, is much more involved in the logistics, etc. The Americans are playing a less important role in doing that. Of course, the US is contributing with intelligence and other very important contributions and surveillance. But I saw this report where Macron said that, hey, the French are contributing also with a significant part of the intelligence.
But not the targeting.
Not the targeting. So, but this idea between the Plan A and Plan B that Keir touched upon, what do you think about this?
If I meant Plan B for Europe, not for Ukraine. Plan B for Europe if and when it becomes clear that the reliance on the shared interest that we heard so much about this morning is not enough to keep the United States.
So what's the Plan B then?
I hope there is one.
Okay, so we don't.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Okay.
But so because this you touched upon this, Katarzyna, about European support, European homogeneity, political support, and commitment to actually really supporting Ukraine. Where do you see it heading? Also in Poland, you have been very strong supporter of Ukraine, but at the same time on the political right in many European countries, you see that support for Ukraine is fading. We heard it in the discussion between Espen, Barth, Eide and Sikorski that, well, some countries in the northern eastern part are much more eager to fund Ukraine than the others, etc. So where do you see it moving? Is it because there's a failure of recognition of the situational awareness? So if we update our picture, then we will invest in Ukraine, or have we lost the commitment and willingness to actually do what it takes?
Well, there's so many things to unpack here, but if you're asking me about public views in Europe, I think they are not shifting one or the other direction. They're fluctuous. So you have moments when it seems that Europe is tired of supporting Ukraine and people don't want to hear about this anymore. And then the far right comes in, why are we paying money, and so on and so forth. And then you have situations like right now when people see the images coming from Kiev, people living in their houses when there's +5, +7 apartments, and you see that shift of attitudes again happening, and again interest, and again people fundraising and so on. I would say rather, knowing how people's span attention is short, that 4 years of the type of engagement of European countries in general in this war shows that we understood that this is about us. Yes, and even if not all of Europeans understand this, the majority of elites today understand this. And this is also why Vladimir Putin today and the Russian propaganda considers Europe as the main enemy. There's no longer talking about the US and Trump. There's no longer talking even about NATO. If you watch Russian TV, and I have to unfortunately do this from time to time, then you hear the Europe. Yes, that this is the biggest problem, the broken, bad, corrupt Europe that has tried to wage a war against Russia. So even the Russians understand that this has been, a really sustained effort on our behalf. Are we doing enough? Absolutely not. And of course, you all know here, we mentioned it many times, there's so many other things we should be doing, starting from economic pressure, seizing the shadow fleet, and the fact that the Americans did it so wildly around Venezuela gave us a free card. The Russians were really afraid of this. If the Americans can do this to us without even consulting us taking over, then the Europeans will see this as a pretext. And we're seeing this, but now we have to act upon this. State frozen assets, Russian state frozen assets. Well, luckily we did froze them indefinitely now, but we're still not using them. They are our trump card. They're a very important card that also will show Russia whether Europe is really determined, because the price we might pay for using these frozen assets is tangible, is important. But we can do much more on the military, helping Ukraine actually with weapon deliveries. If you listen to President Zelensky, the main thing he's saying the last 2 weeks is that everything is coming with delay. Everything is coming with delay. They would not be in such a situation today with Kiev if everything were on time for the air missile defense shield that they've created. And last, and this is something that politicians don't want to hear, is the political support. And the political support is not only saying, yes, we support Ukraine, but actually creating a sustainable and fast path to EU membership. To EU membership. Yes, and then you hear EU membership and all the politicians are like, oh, that's so complicated. Yes, Merkel saying, well, that's not going to happen in a fast track. How can Ukrainians survive knowing that the reason that actually they started the Euromaidan in 2014, so being part of Europe, being part of united Europe is not available, is not on the table, is not something that they have a living horizon to. So all these things there can be done and should be done. And that also requires educating our populations, telling every time over and over again why this is our war. Not only saying it's our war, but why and what type of consequences we will bear. And my only fear when we talk about Plan B, because I also don't know what Europe's Plan B is, but my only fear is that the only Plan B is the one that will happen not when Trump actually ditches completely the peace process in Ukraine, but once something really bad happens in Ukraine. So there is a breakthrough and a success of the Russians on the front. There is, an expected movement of the Russian troops towards Kiev and so on. And God forbid, the Ukrainians actually starting to lose this big time when we see that the Russians have a standing chance to politically take over Kiev. I think that is the only time where European politicians will have to sit down and say, are we willing to fight and die on the Ukrainian side, knowing that we are really next? That will be the moment when politicians in Poland will have to ask themselves, are we willing to send Polish troops and fight there instead of in 2 years fighting here? Yeah? And this, I fear, is the Plan B, that politicians don't realize that they are actually sleepwalking into when they don't do what has to be done today to help Ukraine.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you so much. Now you presented a list of what to do and also consequences of not doing, so to say. But we have presented a picture, you have presented a picture of Russia being basically unaffected, or Putin not unaffected somehow of the situation. But right before Christmas, or was it around the first week of January, Gideon Rachman in the Financial Times wrote a small piece, and he said, according to some reports, Russia lost close to 30,000 soldiers in December alone, whereas the Ukrainians they're losing at the rate of 1 to 25. 1 to 25. Right, so 25 times more Russians than Ukrainians are being killed. So now you have this question that I initially asked you about the dynamics at the battlefield. So could you help us to explain a bit about how Ukraine have been able to deter Russia, or to stop with this new technological, let's say, kill zone being established there, that is not so dense in human resources, but apparently for Russia, they have to push in a lot of human resources, and unfortunately kill them by trying to progress. And after all, they have not been that successful in progressing in Ukraine, although they inflict a lot of harm. The kind of distance carried is quite limited. Or
yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with you. First, 2 or 3 comments to what I've just heard from my compatriots here. In my view, I mean, Europe does not actually agree on the seriousness of the Russian threat. And why do I think that? The problem is that if you look at the numbers coming out of the Kiel Institute, you will see that for 2025, this is the year since the very beginning where Ukraine has got far less money than before. We should also be aware that about half of NATO's countries have not been given anything to Ukraine in 2025, including, as we have mentioned, the United States, which of course is affecting, among other things, all the missiles coming through the air defense systems in Ukraine. Because as Zelensky has said, the launchers are empty. There are no missiles there, or they are arriving way too late. So this downward trend of giving money to Ukraine, buying stuff for Ukraine, is directly seen in the damage caused on the electricity grid and everything that we can read about in the media. And of course, seen from the Russian perspective, you can also read the numbers from the Kiel Institute. So in my mind, there is not a coherent opinion in Europe that Russia is such a magnificent threat. I mean, it's widely different living in Spain compared to living in Lithuania, for example. Okay, having said that, and also the other issue is that I think it's been pretty clear ever since at least late 2022 that Russia is not going to accept any kind of peace agreement that will put in doubt if Russia won the war or not. That has to do with the regime survival of Putin. Putin cannot accept the kind of peace agreement or ceasefire or whatever that could possibly raise a discussion about if the decision to go to war and pay all this tremendous cost was worth it. And that could actually destabilize the regime. Then let's go to the battlefield. I think that the numbers are pretty much correct. Russia has suffered tremendous losses over the last year, actually. On a monthly average, around 30,000 killed or seriously wounded. And that also actually explains why the last 20% of the Donetsk region is so important to Russia. I mean, if you make the assumption that Russia will, based upon the progress they have on a monthly basis, it will take at least 1 year, maybe more, to take this area, the last 20%. Of course, Putin will prefer that Trump will hand that over to him for no cost. That would be a great solution. I mean, diplomacy can sometimes deliver what your military cannot deliver. That's what he's hoping for. But if you make a prediction on the casualties, taking those 20%, and say that they will not advance any quicker than they've done so far, that means at least 1 year, maybe more, and they will still lose at least 30,000 a month. We are up to between 400,000, 500,000 casualties to take the last 20%. Of course, you prefer Trump to hand that to you. And I think it's fair to say that Ukraine has really established quite a good defense line as we see it today. We should remember that if we go back to November 2022, the front line has not moved very much. It's been pretty stable. And since the drone warfare, the minefields, the obstacles and all that basically have eliminated traditional maneuver from the battlefield. Read mechanized forces taking new land quite quickly. We are back to a slow progress with infantry that is causing a tremendous amount of casualties on the Russian side. And that's what we see is happening. That's why we have this 25-1 in some of the months that we have behind us. Will this be sustainable in the long run? Putin seems to think so. If you ask Ukrainian officers, they don't think Russia can sustain that for, eternity. So add that, as I agree to what has been said about the Russian economy, this is the first year, I think it's fair to say, that you can clearly see that the sanction and the cost of the war is taking a heavy toll on the Russian economy. So I'm sure that if you are in Moscow, they are not opening new bottles every evening of expensive champagne either. First of all, it's not that much to celebrate, and the other problem is, of course, you don't have money to buy it anymore. So it is a situation, I think, that if we push Russia, if we really, really start to support Ukraine the way we should, it's possible to, at the end of the day, to get an acceptable compromise for kind of future peace, or at least ceasefire arrangement.
Okay, thank you. So, let me switch the topic of the conversation slightly, because, Keir, your argument, initial argument, is that both Russia and Ukraine have a coalition behind them, somehow supporting them. And we talked slightly about the shadow fleet and the oil economy. I've worked a bit on the shadow fleet, and it's really difficult to find a way of approaching that topic. Insurance, yeah, but there are lots of topics that we shouldn't open that thing. But I recognize this, it's interesting to see that there's more sanctions on that, and there's more being done then on the coalition supporting Ukraine. But I'm just curious on the coalition supporting Russia, because for NATO for quite some time there's been this standard saying that China is the ultimate enabler, strategic enabler for Russia. And what we call sanction and shadow fleet is for China to some extent a discount mechanism. So they get access to cheaper energy and cheaper. How do you see China's view on Russia and the Ukraine war? You said up to now they've said, yeah, let's refrain from using nuclear weapons, but apart from that, you're comfortable.
Absolutely. Where Russia has the luxury of time in the short term, China has the luxury of time in the long term. They can sit and wait while Russia destroys itself and then pick up the pieces. And in the meantime, the cheap energy the increasing concessions that they are taking from Russia on a daily basis, things that we weren't expecting to happen in that relationship with China, between China and Russia, for another 10, 15 years. The trajectory was clear: China stronger, Russia weaker, but we didn't think it would happen so soon, that they would be putting demands on Russia that they are now. The war has accelerated that process, and that will continue to happen. So eventually, there will come a point at the time of China's choosing where it can demand something from Russia that Moscow will find distinctly uncomfortable. But China can sit back and wait until Russia cannot do anything about it, rather than precipitate.
But your prime minister, he visited China recently, Keir Starmer. Not the European leaders fly to Beijing. So if you're writing a memo to them, say, okay, what should they bring up with President Xi in the relationship with Ukraine? What should they say to President Xi and expect, and what kind of pressure, leverage should they put on him in order to maybe reflect a bit more on the support they're giving to Russia?
Sadly, the chances of Keir Starmer reading a memo from any of us in this room, some of whom have written quite a few, are very, very slim, because he would not want to read what we have to say. Given the current British government's absolute determination to trade away any leverage it has in international relations whatsoever. What should have been said a long time ago was explaining how China's interest is not, in fact, served by continuing to foster the destabilization that the war on Europe will eventually bring. But instead, their interests lie elsewhere. But that, too, has been traded away. Any leverage that there could have been in trying to persuade China to be a more constructive partner internationally, I think has now long gone.
I think we have some competition there in the back.
Yeah.
You want to share with us?
Okay, so
Yeah.
okay, so somebody having a busy.
No, but if I may only, add just one thing on China, we need to remember that whatever we as Europeans or the United States would do, China is not getting out of bed with Russia anytime soon. They have a long-term strategic interest in at least 3 areas. First, weakening U.S. leadership. Second, making sure that Western unity basically dissolves, and last but not least, creating some kind of alternative economic structures to the Western world. And that has been, a very clear line that Beijing has pursued, and Russia and the war, but specifically the Russian regime, is helping in all 3 areas. And if you understand this, there's not much you can offer to China to change its mind, because China has understood that a strong West, a strong America, is not in its best interest and is doing everything to counter that. Of course, that doesn't mean we can't do anything at all. If you see the recent data coming out of export-imports on gas, actually the secondary sanctions that the Trump administration has started to not even implement, but slowly kind of suggest on China, actually have had some impact. So it's not like the Chinese are willing to take the economic cost for this war, and they're definitely not willing to take the security cost of this war. So they have really good, a very good situation in which, in relations with Russia, especially on the oil and gas front, they can decide on the price of the products they're buying, on the terms of delivery, on whether to build or not build, invest or not invest in infrastructure, but they bear no security costs of this war. So, this is also not a deal for Russia that is a beautiful deal, and the majority of elites actually in Moscow understand this, but they simply have no other alternative.
Okay, so I see we're getting closer to the end of this session. So it's always a bit depressing to discuss the situation in Russia. Of course, it's rather dim, but the heroic efforts by the Ukrainians. We have to make sure that we, as you said, that we get our priorities straight, do the action, do the support that is necessary now. So can we try to encourage you all towards the end now for kind of final round to say, okay, in 2026, what is it that you would like to see? Not only kind of something very wishful or hopeful, but some elements that you think are pointing us in the right direction. Where we are heading and where there are reasons to be optimistic, and what you are in particular looking for. Should I start with you, Arne?
Yes, thanks. I'm not so sure if I'm that optimistic about 2026, unfortunately. But what I would really like to see happening, and what, I mean, it's realistic. I mean, much more European countries could actually financially support Ukraine a lot more than we are doing today. And I mean, we can sweet talk about whatever we like, but at the end of the day, it boils down to money. Money buys weapons that Ukraine need. Money sees to it that the Ukrainian society is functioning, and so on and so on. And we should remember, as I said a few minutes ago, that in 2025, a lot of European countries have hardly contributed with anything, or very close to anything. So the most effective thing we could do is to support Ukraine a lot more. And you really didn't have to pay that much more if each and every country just chipped in a reasonable amount of support for Ukraine. That's what I would like to see happening. But for that to happen, we need to start pointing fingers more strongly at those countries not paying very much or not paying anything at all. And for the time being, the United States is not paying anything. Everything that comes out of the US is paid for by Europe. That's a cold fact.
And Arne, in addition, we could add that paying now is much cheaper than paying a lot later. But
definitely.
Yeah. Well, we have the money. We have 200 billion state-frozen Russian assets. Give it into a fund. The fund, if you want, can be managed by the European Commission or a committee of all member states or whatever else you want to, and give it to Ukraine for the weapons and for sustaining the country. That gives 2.5 or maybe even 3 years for Ukraine to survive. That's a perspective that changes the political calculus for Putin. It's a completely different situation in which he's thinking, oh, next year Le Pen is going to win in France. I got them. Game over. Yeah? He was willing to sustain, 1 more year waiting for the next election in a big country that's going to change the political situation. He is not willing, however, to sustain, a situation in which his own money is going to Ukraine for at least 2.5 years with no political strings attached. Yes, whatever happens in the European political cycle, that is not going to change it. So that is number one. Second, I said it once, I said it again, the oil and the gas is the key. Yes, I mean, tighten up the sanctions. The Commission is coming up with great ideas, but they're coming up with these ideas 2 years too late. Yeah, we hear them in every package. There's a better idea how to do this. It is bringing results. I remind you that the projected GDP growth of Russia today is 0.6%. 0.6. Yes, the bonanza of the big defense industry is over. Yes, for Russia. So Russia is also running out of time economically, but it can sustain a year, 2, but it cannot sustain long-term help for Ukraine. So if we don't do these things, then might as well we can prepare, for a much larger war in the perspective of 2 to 5 years.
Care, time is running out, but you should also be allowed to have a perspective on 2026.
Arne is right, this question is a trap. Every time I am asked, I am demanded to give a forecast that is optimistic, that turns out to be the one place where I get it completely wrong. What could we hope for, though? What could we hope for?
Yeah.
The emergence of a plan B. which is Europe finally taking an interest in its own defense, but finding a means not of replacing those American capabilities that may or may not still be available, but instead finding a means of standing on their own 2 feet without them. Now, we heard just in the last session, it is not that we have to be as powerful as the United States, we just have to be more powerful than Putin in order to demonstrate to Russia that the costs and consequences of further military adventurism would be more than the benefits. That's all that's required. So an innovative solution to find means of deterring Russia using new technologies, which are already available, under the leadership of that part of Europe to which people from my country have given up our own government, look for leadership, namely the Nordic and Baltic region, galvanizing Europe to understand that it is at a moment of historic choice, and the consequences of getting the choice wrong are catastrophic.
Excellent, thank you so much. Kir guys, Katarzyna Pisarska, Arne Bård Dalhaug. Thank you so much. I should say that we now have a 30-minute coffee break, and please resume back then, and top of the hour. Thank you so much.